Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Indiana is 7-2 following a 28-point loss against Auburn over the weekend down in Atlanta. To help us briefly recap that game, we're also going to go through the roster and give some thoughts on all of IU's scholarship players through the first 9 games. Ryan Corazza of Inside the Hall is back on Podcast on the Brink. Welcome back to the show, Ryan.
Happy to be here.
Early on a Monday morning, we're recording this one, but Indiana, just a really disappointing game against Auburn over the weekend. The Hoosiers come out very strong, 22-10, uncharacteristically. Their first, 12 points were on three-pointers, so they surpassed their season average and made three-pointers in the game, I think, in the first 3 or 4 minutes, which was a bit of a surprise and maybe kind of a little bit giving fans maybe a little bit of false hope with that start because they were shooting it so well from the perimeter. But Auburn made some adjustments, and then basically just the last 35 minutes of that game completely dominated Indiana. Ryan, I guess a 2-part question for you. What takeaways did you have maybe from Indiana getting that nice start against the Tigers? Was it more in your eyes just kind of a mirage in terms of them hitting those three-pointers early? And then also just the total collapse of the defense after that point. Was that something that was that maybe more a perfect storm of Auburn playing its best game, or Indiana really just kind of failing to meet the intensity that they need to the rest of that game?
Well, I guess to kind of zoom out at large, to answer your questions, I think it was a bit of a mirage, yes. And in terms of the defense, look, I think this just sort of continues a trend that we've seen so far in the Woodson era, where he has talked about winning the Big Ten championships and getting back on the national stage and winning national championships, and has scheduled these marquee games in the non-conference year. But the reality is they've been wildly unsuccessful in these games, right? I believe I saw in the 4 games now, what is it? This year between UConn and Auburn, and then last year with Kansas and Arizona, like the average margin of loss is 21 points. And I think this game, obviously, I think it was like the first almost 11 minutes they had a lead in this one. But through all 4 of those games, I think their lead has only been like 13, 14 minutes total. So they've really been outclassed and not been in these games at all. And it's a lot of this is starting to feel like, I think we're about maybe 80 games into Woodson's tenure, and it's starting to feel like, this is kind of just the trend for right now. Maybe things will change in the future, but I think when there has been sort of this heavy emphasis on getting the ball into the post and having sort of individual play there, that can work against, maybe 75% of the competition. But there's an upper echelon of these teams that have elite athletes, and that can really kind of spread you out, that when you're actually matched up against them, those one-on-one matchups are tougher, and they can actually kind of use their size and athleticism to make things more difficult. And it seems to be like once that happens, like things just sort of fall apart. And because there's really no plan B or any change, I almost feel like the players are like, we're playing a different game here. It's kind of like a chess and checkers, and they almost sort of are like resigned to the fact that their game plan just can't work. And I almost feel like mentally they sort of lose it a bit, and then there's these big slides. I mean, I even look at the Miami game too. I know Indiana did grab a lead in the second half of that game in the NCAA tournament last year, but that was another team that really over 40 minutes just wore them out and were more athletic and were playing a different game.
Yeah, even that St. Mary's game the first season, and I know the circumstances of that one were a little bit different in terms of the travel in Indiana having to go west after playing a game in Dayton, but they were completely outclassed in that game. And that's not to take away from any of the great wins that Mike Woodson's having. He's 3-1 against Purdue in his first 2 seasons. That's obviously a huge improvement over the previous regime. But I agree with you in terms of just having that one singular thing, at least offensively, that they seem to do really well, which is get the ball in the paint and score and get to the foul line, and not really having anything else beyond that to hang their hat on. But the defense too, you look at what he was able to do in that first season. I think they were a top 25 defense in Ken Palm. Last year was a little bit of a regression. They were still in the top 50. This year they're hovering, I think, somewhere in the 70s. So there's been a clear slide backwards defensively as well. And I think when you look at what Mike Woodson talks about, how he wants to build his program and the assistant coaches, Yasir Roseman was on the radio show last week with Don Fisher in Woodson's place, and he talked about being a defense first program. When you're giving up 104 points on a neutral court to Auburn, that really doesn't, give a lot of confidence that this program is where it needs to be defensively. And one of the reasons, I wanted to have you on this week is to kind of take stock on the roster and the players through the first 9 games. We've got a decent sample size now. Over a quarter of the regular season has elapsed now. But before we dive into kind of some of the players individually, just the roster construction, I think, is one thing that kind of popped into my head when you started talking about how the Auburn game went and them being able to, maybe against 75% of the teams they play, it's going to work, but other opponents, maybe they have more athleticism, more guard depth that really stands out. And there's no better example, I don't think, than the Auburn game the other day, where they just had waves of guys who were athletic, that could handle the ball, could get to their spots. And Indiana just doesn't have that. And in many ways, you can look at that as, a criticism of just how this roster was put together. And I know Indiana went in the transfer portal and tried to get some guards and some guys that could, shoot from the perimeter. But the reality is they don't have many, really, if any, guys that, with Xavier Johnson currently sidelined, they don't have many guards who can create off the dribble, get in the lane and create shots for other guys. And they don't have enough 3-point shooting. And when you get up against a team that, like Auburn, with the athleticism, the quickness, and just the depth that they have over a 40-minute game, it wears you down. And the personnel, I think, was the biggest thing that stood out to me when watching Indiana against Auburn. They were just playing a completely different game. They were able to play it with much more pace. They were able to be much more aggressive, particularly defensively, because of the depth that they had at key positions, where they weren't worried about if guys got a couple fouls because they had somebody else they could just throw in off the bench to take the place. Did you kind of have the same observation in terms of just the roster and looking at it, particularly going against a team like Auburn, where it was just like Indiana just doesn't have the personnel that it needs to compete in a game like this? And I think in many ways it's something that Indiana really needs to address beginning next season. They've got to have better guard play.
Totally agree. And sometimes this is with recruiting, with the transfer portal now, it can be a difficult endeavor to kind of keep the consistency there, because I would say if you think about last season, Jalen Hood-Schifino going pro probably was not something that almost anybody thought was actually going to happen. And not saying that he's whatever the most hyper athletic player ever and whatnot, but I will say that he's someone that can take a ball screen and play make. He can make plays for himself, and I think that is a player that was a one and done, and so that's it, right? And they've tried to, look at this recruiting cycle for the upcoming year. They were in the mix for Boogie Flan very hard until the end, and things did not come through there, right? He's did not choose Indiana. And then even the transfer portal, I know some of the names they were in on, like you think of like a Dalton Connect. Obviously, he's a little bit of different and bigger player, more like a wing, but you've seen some of the highlights of him on Tennessee this year, and it really jumps out. Some of the athleticism and some of the plays he's been making, and some of the shooting he can do as well. So it's kind of like this chicken and the egg, because I feel like when Woodson came here talking about 4 out, 1 in, talking about the 3-ball changed the game. And to me, there's, I think in my postseason piece last year, just on our That's a Wrap series, writing about Woodson and sort of the I don't know, the kind of the stubbornness he can sometimes have. But I think with this roster, because Khalil Ware was the player that he got out of the transfer portal, which he's a great player. There's, 10 times out of 10, you're going to take him, and he's been great. But, if you swap that out for a dynamic guard instead, things could be different here. So but at the same time, this has sort of been a longer narrative now, reaching back to the Archie Miller era with the dynamic guards and the 3-point shooting, right? And without either of those, they are exposed in these games. So, up until now, I think you can see that the program hasn't had the shooting, or the roster construction. Maybe they have it. I do feel like, they could play a little bit differently, but again, with this sort of Woody's, I don't know, stubbornness or just the way he wants to play with the roster that he has, it's still get the ball inside, because Renew was another guy that sort of fell into their lap after he decommitted from Florida. And it's like, again, he's such a skilled player. You want to take him. And then you think of some other players that didn't pan out, right? Like Tamar Bates, where you would have thought at least a little bit more dynamic play. That didn't work out. I mean, I know this wasn't a Woodson recruit, but Christian Lander came in as a 5-star. And obviously that was someone that didn't pan out either. So I don't know if it's just luck or timing, but it's all to say that at the end of the day, they haven't had those type of players, and they haven't emphasized the 3-point shot. And that has made them very susceptible in these high level games.
Yeah, I think you can give a little bit of a pass in terms of Hood Schifino going pro this year. It obviously wasn't something they expected, and they did try really hard in the spring to address the guard needs in the portal, and just didn't work out. But I think the thing that kind of has people a little bit concerned moving forward is you kind of look at what they have signed for 2024, and it's Liam McNeely. Yes, he's a shooter, but he's not a guy that you're going to necessarily put handling the ball, creating a lot in the offense, at least from what I've seen. I mean, obviously he's a scorer and a 5-star kid, but I think they really have to place a huge emphasis this spring in the portal on just getting more guys that can make plays with the ball on the perimeter and shoot reliably from the perimeter, because right now they just don't have that on the roster. And you see it with kind of the number of 3-point attempts that guys are making on a game-to-game basis. It's just not heavy enough volume. So you mentioned Khalil Ware. I want to start with him in terms of just talking about some of the players on this roster and kind of what we've seen through 9 games. The other day was really the first time this season where we've seen Ware bothered maybe a little bit by a team that was athletic, obviously, and physical. UConn, I guess, to an extent as well, going against their big man in that game. But for the most part, he's passed every other test, has been Indiana's best, most valuable player. It's really stood out to me just how incredible his touch is from the perimeter, at the free throw line, around the rim. Indiana obviously wasn't going to be able to replace Trace Jackson Davis. Khalil Ware, and by no means has replaced Trace Jackson Davis, but he's a player that's just a lot of fun to watch because of how skilled he is. He's answered a lot of questions about, we heard everything about the motor and all that. I think it's kind of been run into the ground by this point, and kind of a thing in the past. He's answered those questions through 9 games. What stood out to you just so far about Khalil Ware and the impact he's been able to have since arriving in Bloomington?
Well, yeah, I agree that, he's been, I guess you could say he's been kind of their all-around most productive player. Motor stuff, I suppose, has been answered. We talked about this last time I was on the pod, but I really think it's more his sort of demeanor, and that he's not super demonstrative, that I think fed into that a bit last year. And really just kind of stuff in the stat sheet too. Just beyond scoring, I mean, he's had some big double-doubles, games with a lot of blocks, steals. And I think he's been a pretty good passer too, which was not something maybe coming into this that we would have observed. I do wonder, sort of harkening back here to the larger narrative of this team, I see a game like yesterday where, in really the last 2 games, because this is what's going to, and it's going to continue to happen in league play, as he gets fronted in the post obsessively because he keeps trying to get him the ball. And I think yesterday against Auburn, I don't even think he Saturday against Auburn, he had a true shot attempt in the second half, and he couldn't even get the ball up above his waist at times. He has shown he's got great touch on his shot, and he can hit a 3-pointer. Let me check real quick. He's shooting what on the year here now? He's 6 of 12. I know it's not, again, a huge volume, but you could say that for pretty much everybody on the roster. He's shooting 6 of 12, 50%. It's the best on the team. I guess Xavier Johnson is technically 5 of 10, but he hasn't played in several games. Do you just pick and pop with him a little bit in that second half or in the first half? And I think he has more of a varied offensive game than he's almost been allowed to show in this offense. And I'm not sitting here saying that they're going to do it. They're going to make him more of a 3-point shooter. I think Woodson's even spoke to the fact that, like, well, why would he shoot threes if he can score inside? But that's one thing I'd be interested as the season goes along, especially if they're going to have be behind the 8 ball in both volume and percentage, that if you have a guy shooting 50% and he's really getting harassed down low, bring him out and see what happens on occasion.
Yeah, that's totally fair. With Malik Renew is another guy who's really kind of elevated his game this year. One thing that I've really been tracking is just his fouls this season. After last season, he averaged, I think, 6.8 fouls per 40 minutes. He's down this year to 3.8, which is a better number. I think still maybe a little bit higher than where you would like to see it. He's had some games where he's had to go to the bench with foul issues. And the Maryland game, I think he only played 19 minutes as a result of foul trouble. And in the Louisville game, I know he played only 20 minutes based on the fact that he had 4 fouls in that game. So he's too valuable for Indiana to have on the bench, particularly against the top competition. But he's really impressed me just with his ability his footwork to score in the paint. He's not a guy that's going to blow you away with his athleticism, but he really has a knack for spin moves, and his footwork in the post has been really impressive. The one thing with him I think that's been a little bit disappointing is just his rebounding numbers overall. You look at his defensive rebounding percentage, it's a little bit lower than you would like for a guy in his position. He was limited minutes last season. He was 18.8% defensive rebounding percentage. This year he's down to 13.9. Some of that may be just the fact that Khalil Ware is down there too, and grabbing a bunch of boards as well. But that's the thing with Renew. I think I want to see the most improvement with going forward is just becoming a better rebounder. But overall, I think for the most part, he's been, a really solid player, a guy that looks like he could challenge for one of the all Big Ten teams when it's all said and done by the end of the year. And the combo of him and Ware has been pretty fun to watch together. The chemistry that they build and the interior passing, I think that's something that Indiana needs to continue to develop. And with Ware, I think one thing you can do with him is move him out to the perimeter a little bit and have him as a kick out option for a guy like Renew, so that you're not just so congested in the paint. But obviously, they've done a really good job, I think, so far, at least through 9 games of playing off of each other and learning each other's games and helping each other both elevate in their second seasons of college basketball.
Yeah, he's really jumped up a level from last year. Obviously, the fouls were kind of prohibitive for him as a freshman, but I've been really impressed with how well he has been able to score. And I know we talked about where or not reproducing or being what TJD was, but with Renew, his left hand off kind of the right block there does remind you a lot of TJD at times, just the way that he's getting buckets and the way that he's scoring. Agreed on the rebounding. I think I had a play in today's film session where I felt like he just was standing ball watching and his guy went right around him and got a tip and dunk. And so some of the effort, I think, there could probably be improved. But he also seems like he's kind of jumped into a bit of a leadership role here, too, for Indiana. Has been more vocal. So huge, kind of sophomore leap here. And I've been impressed with him pretty much overall.
Yeah, I think one thing that kind of stands out to me when you look at this roster is you have those two guys that have been pretty much a consistent presence throughout the first 9 games. They've all, they've had their ups and downs too, but to a lesser extent than some of the rest of the roster, which I think is kind of maybe a little bit of the issue with this team right now against these better teams like UConn and Auburn is you have a couple of guys, you can rely on, but where is the rest of the production? Where's the rest of the consistency going to come from? And two of the guys that we thought that were going to be reliable for most of the season, one of them has obviously missed some time now with injury, and Xavier Johnson, and Trey Galloway seems like he's really struggling this season with just his consistency offensively and maybe pressing a little bit too much sometimes offensively. And I know he's being asked to do a lot, but I think Indiana needs a lot more from him. And I think those two guys, really, their inconsistency so far is a big reason that the guard play has not been up to standard. Obviously, Johnson, the injury thing is out of his control, but Indiana needs him back on the court and healthy when Big Ten play resumes for them to be able to make a run towards a third straight NCAA tournament. I want to talk more about Galloway, though, because he's maybe being asked to do a little bit more this season than I don't want to say that what his talent level is capable of, but last year he was surrounded by, Jalen Hood-Schifino, Trace Jackson Davis, Miller Kopp, who could space the floor, Race Thompson, a 6-year senior at the time, and he was maybe, the fifth guy on the scouting report when the game started, and maybe that allowed him offensively to get some more open looks or to not be a guy that the defense was as keyed on. This year is a little bit different because now with Gabe Cupp starting next to him, opposing defenses are able to, key a little bit more on him. And it's obviously taken its toll. I mean, his 3-point shooting percentage is way down. His shot just does not look nearly as efficient or as smooth as it was last season. Is this something you think Galloway can work his way out of, or is this more of just kind of what he's going to be as a player now that he's thrust into a bigger role? Because it seems like maybe he's more suited to be an energy guy off the bench or a backup, and he's being asked to do a lot more than that at this point.
It's probably a combination of both of those things. I do feel like he is a little bit miscast on this roster. And he's a senior, he's a captain. So, okay, it's time to, I don't know, do a little bit more or whatever based off of that. But I do feel like he is best suited more as a role player and as an energy guy off the bench. And, I think a 6th man or 7th man on a really good team, he would be perfect for. So I think that's part of it. I have not attended any games in person, and clearly I'm not, in the locker room. I'm not there day to day, but just his general demeanor, he just seems sort of a little off on the court. And I think, I don't know if mentally, he's trying to get things right too, because his 3-point shooting, I mean, he's 3 of 22 on the year. He's shooting 13.6%. So it's not just that it's down. I mean, it's way down. Even look at his freshman year. I mean, he shot 18%, obviously not great, but he was up to 21.4% as a sophomore. And last year, I mean, he shot 46%. I know it was a low volume with 65, but he made 30 of 65 last year. And now to start this year, just 3 of 22. And you can really tell he is hesitant. I think, against Michigan, was it that he airballed that 3? I think he had like 3 in the second half, like in pretty quick succession. He just seems like he doesn't want to shoot. And so for a team that has limited opportunities to shoot 3-pointers, and he is on the court a lot and is getting the opportunity to shoot some pretty open threes at times, to not have confidence right now in his shot is another reason that the 3-point shooting has suffered. So we'll see. Maybe if Xavier Johnson gets back and it can lighten the load for him a bit. But yeah, I do feel like he's just sort of pressing overall, and it sort of spilled out and over into maybe just mentally him still trying to get himself together as the season goes along here.
Yeah, maybe one of those things too, where he just needs a big game or a moment maybe to to kind of get his confidence back. And maybe that turns him around. But it's been tough to watch at times just because you can tell that he doesn't have any confidence in the perimeter shot. And if he can't keep defenses honest with that, it's easy to kind of plan for what he's going to do offensively and try in terms of getting into the lane. He's been effective in the past, just kind of getting to the baseline and making plays or getting into the lane with that floater. But if he doesn't have the 3-point shot to fall back on a little bit, he's just so limited offensively. Another guy that kind of falls in the same category in terms of being up and down with Galloway is Mackenzie Mbako. Obviously, Mike Woodson's kind of gone out of his way to defend him in the media and talk about, the need for everyone to give him time and develop. And we've seen some improvement for him recently. He's played better than he had early on, but there's still some things with him that you kind of look at and say there's a lot of room for growth. Defensively, he'll have times where he just has a lapse and misses an assignment. A guy gets open on a back cut, or he leaves a shooter open and costs Indiana, an open shot. I think those are things that he really has to get better at. But the other thing, the 3-point shooting, he's 6 of 29 this season, less than 21%, which has been a little bit surprising just based on how he was billed as a knockdown shooter from the perimeter. And offensively, really the rest of his game, I've been a little bit maybe surprised at just how tentative he seemed at times to kind of go towards the rim off the dribble or try to get some points in the paint. I know he has been a little bit better recently. That Maryland game, I thought he was really good trying to go to the offensive glass, but he seems pretty one-dimensional right now from a scoring perspective. He is 21 of 21 from the free throw line, so that speaks to me like he should try to maybe do some things to get fouled more, get to the line more. What, just early in the season so far, what have been your impressions of Mbako and kind of where he is as a player and maybe where he is relative to your expectations for him coming in?
Well, if nothing else, I do feel like based off of his slow start, and especially on the defensive end, it was real rough to start. There has been more of an emphasis when he's on the court of doing some more of the little things. As you said, the rebounding, which is getting him some more points, and also within that, sometimes picking up the fouls. And he has been, lights out from the free throw line. I feel like so many of his are just like the absolute bottom of the net. So it's been good to see that if the 3-point shooting has struggled and maybe he hasn't come in and really blown the doors off everything, that some of the attention to detail and some of the little things to get more points and such he's doing to actually have an impact. And I think that's helped him stay on the court for longer stretches. Woodson had a really short kind of leash on him, so to speak, in terms of really pulling him out of games if he was not playing to the standard that Woodson expected on both ends. And I think that has pretty much subsided. Not to it's not fully gone, but I think him sitting for an entire second half or whatever, I think those days are probably done based on the improvement that he's shown. The 3-point shooting, if you're making 21 out of 21 at the free throw line, but only shooting 20% from three, and you came as a shooter, I don't really know, again, what that's about. I think his shot seems good. Sometimes, you could argue maybe some of them are a little bit too quick trigger, etc. But I think for a player of his caliber, I think that's fine. I don't really think he's forced a lot of them, but for whatever, and a lot of them look pure, they look good, and then he's had a lot, I feel like, just rim out or just bounce out. So we'll see over the course of the year if he's 6 of 29 now, if that can improve, and maybe he can get into the 30s by the end of the year. But I do feel like sort of the opposite of Jalen Hood-Schifino, where I think a lot of people maybe expected Mackenzie Mbako to be a one and done. Right now, just sort of based on his full body of work, that doesn't feel very likely. So he may be someone that, will just kind of continue to grind along and improve here. And, if all goes to plan and he has another off season, he could maybe have sort of a Malik Renew type jump where he's hitting those expectations more of shooting. He's more comfortable. He knows the college game better. He knows how to play in the flow of an offense. He's better on the defensive end. And some more of the expectations might be met.
Yeah, he's interesting because when we talked to him before the season at Media Day, he was dead set on he wants to be a one and done. And you saw him early in the year on some of those draft boards and talked about, you don't see him anywhere on draft boards right now based on his start. So it's an interesting one because if you have the mindset that you're going to be a one and done coming into college and then you don't meet those expectations, it's kind of, for some guys, maybe a little bit humbling, and you have to maybe figure out, what the best path forward is. So he's definitely, I wouldn't say it's too late for him to turn it around and be a guy that can go after 1 year, but he's going to have to really turn things around in a big way and show a lot more on both ends, I think, to be a guy that the NBA would be interested in taking after 1 year. The rest of the guys in this roster are kind of defined as the bench. Well, although Gabe Cupps has been starting, I kind of want to just kind of move through these guys quickly and get your thoughts on a few of them. Obviously, Anthony Walker, Peyton Sparks, CJ Gunn, Gabe Cupps, and Caleb Banks kind of comprise the guys that are getting the majority of the minutes off the bench. Anthony Leal's been in there a little bit, kind of based out of necessity, but wouldn't consider him at this point a regular part of the rotation. Of those guys, which maybe have impressed you the most this season, and which do you feel like, if I think at some point the rotation's maybe going to get trimmed down a little bit. I don't really see a reason to keep playing 10 guys when you get into the meat of Big Ten schedule. Mike Woodson could surprise us and continue to do that, but who maybe of those guys have separated themselves as earning, kind of a solid spot in the rotation, and who maybe also as well has been disappointing for you? I mean, to me, I think CJ Gunn has done a lot of good things defensively, but the shooting still has not come through from the perimeter. Although I will say the last couple of games, I think he made a 3 against Auburn and he made a couple against Michigan. If that's something he can do with a little bit more regularity, then I think he becomes, a vital part of this team. But I think with all these guys, there's things you can look at that as what they do really well, but also the reason that they're reserves is because they do have some deficiencies to their game.
Yeah, I think at his height and looking at the Michigan game in particular, when CJ Gunn has it all going, I think he has probably the most promise off the bench, just based on if he is hitting shots and he's defending at that level. But it's just been too inconsistent, and he's kind of still working through things. But he's definitely locked in, playing hard, doing what the staff is asking of him, and it's improving there. I think maybe most consistent guy at this point. I know he had some early struggles and there was some decision making on his end that was not great, but Anthony Walker is starting to stick out a bit as well. When we talk about a team that does not have many guys that can take you off the bounce, he's able to grab the ball on the perimeter and take two steps in and get to the rim. So that has worked on a number of occasions this year, and even against Auburn, I think he did it a little bit too. And to me, in a game where Indiana was outclassed athletically, he looked like someone that belonged in that game. And I'm sure from his time at Miami, he's used to being in games like that. So I think he's a plus in against those types of opponents. Caleb Banks, he's still kind of come along as well. He's had some moments, hasn't always been consistent. Sometimes feels like offensively is kind of an afterthought when he comes in. And Peyton Sparks is, he's got great size. I feel like he kind of just continues the front court play when with Renew and where getting the ball so much. When he gets it, he really looks to score. And it goes into him and it doesn't come back out. And similar to Renew, I feel like even if he's double or like triple teamed or there's like 2 guys on him or helps right there, he'll just kind of barrel through and go. Which has been interesting at times to see, but I think he can be his size and his skill, make him a pretty a decent backup. So I don't know. I guess maybe Cupps I didn't hit on. I know you did mention him at the top. He's another one that he's being asked to play a role right now with Xavier Johnson out that it's a little bit above his pay grade. That said, I've been impressed with his ability not to make mistakes. I think a freshman, especially against some of these, he hasn't been perfect defensively. Obviously, I think some of the speed and skill and athleticism and size of some of the guys he's gone up against has been a challenge for him. But he stays in front of guys. He tries not to foul. He moves the ball. I think other freshmen coming into such a role would be making more mistakes. I think that just speaks to the type of player that he is, that he's been able to come in and not do that. And, against Auburn, he showed some more offense as well, which has really not been a part of his game at all so far this season. So I think he's doing what he can, and in the role he's being asked of is doing a pretty adequate job at this point.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing him taking 3-pointers with a little bit more regularity. I mean, look at what percentage Mbako and Galloway are shooting at this point. I'm not saying that can improve, but if Cups is open, he needs to look to shoot the ball. I think he's capable enough to where he can make a couple here and there, and obviously Indiana needs that offense from the perimeter any way they can get it. So he's a guy that I think really can, as the season moves along, maybe he's coming back off the bench once Xavier Johnson gets back in the lineup. And I think this opportunity that he's had now to start can really pay dividends for him down the stretch. He's a guy that I think has been impressive, just the way he's been able to handle the pressure and be able to make a positive impact. Doesn't always stand out in the stat sheet, but I think he's the guy that Indiana can build off for the long haul. Ryan, big picture, just kind of with Indiana to close at 7-2 overall. Is this just about where you thought Indiana would be? Obviously, I think people would be fine with the 7-2 record overall, a win at Michigan. I think really the thing that kind of stands out, though, is just the 2 games that they've had against, the top teams in KenPom, UConn and Auburn. They've been completely beaten badly on neutral courts. I don't know how that, what that means as the season moves along, if it's something they can improve on, but it's clear there's a gap. You look at where they are in KenPom right now, somewhere down in the 70s. There's certainly a gap between the nation's top teams and Indiana. It's just whether can they move up 20 or 30 spots and get themselves kind of in that range of where most teams that come into the tournament as an at-large are, because the numbers, I mean, Mike Woodson was asked about the 3-point shooting, and he said, well, maybe we can be one of those teams that kind of defies the odds and makes the tournament without making a bunch of threes. But I think one thing that you can look at is historically where most of the teams that get picked for the NCAA tournament come from as at-large teams. There's not a lot of teams that are in Indiana's area ranking right now, and a lot of the computer rankings that make it. I know it's early and there's a lot of games left. They can turn it around. But I think right now this is a fringe tournament team, and you got to be happy with the 7-2 record, but you also have to be a little bit concerned as to how badly they've been beaten against the top competition they've faced.
Yeah, I'm certainly no bracketologist, but when you start to look at how things are playing out here, I do agree that this team may be headed for the bubble. Last year, they were able to get that win on the road at Xavier in the non-conference, which I think was the good one to have. But when you look at the totality of the non-conference here, Kansas, if we say Kansas is going to be a loss, they can clearly still win that game. I'm not saying that they can't, but if they don't get that win, they could end sort of the full non-conference slate here, which ends on the 29th of this month against Kennesaw State, 10-3, which is a good record, but I don't see that when they pop the graphic up at the end of the season, the sort of marquee win. I don't see that right now at all on their resume. And the Big Ten this year, the best of my knowledge is down a bit. I mean, you see Michigan State that started the year number 4 in the country are 4-5 now after losing to Nebraska yesterday or over the weekend. It's great that they got those wins against Maryland and Michigan. Those teams are kind of at Indiana's level, more or less. They're ranked around the same in KenPom. Although I guess Michigan is 42nd right now. So they're still a little bit up, but obviously they've had their struggles. So I just think going through the conference slate, they're really going to have to get a volume of wins. And the good news, I think, is one thing Mike Woodson's teams have been good about and has not always been the case is winning on the road in the Big Ten. I think he's prepped them well, and they've been able to go into some places and win, and that might help. And I know Ken Palm's not the end all be all. But right now, the projection is 17-14 overall with a 9-11 record in conference. And that to me is not a recipe for getting into the tournament, save for ripping off a Big Ten tournament championship, which also this program has not shown much success there. So I think it's a volume play and getting the right wins. Obviously, there are going to be some teams that are high up there. I mean, but I think continuing the trend of beating Purdue at home and on the road might be tricky to do to repeat again here. So you look at that, and I mean, there's Wisconsin's out there who is playing better than I think they were projected to, and they're 15 in Ken Palm right now. I know they lost over the weekend at Arizona, but still a pretty good team right now. So they have to be pretty strategic about who they're beating and trying to get a volume up, or else it could be dicey come Selection Sunday.
Yeah, they don't have a win right now against a team that's currently going to make the NCAA tournament. I think that's really the thing that stands out. I mean, Maryland's been a disappointment. They got that win at home. They've won obviously at Michigan, but Michigan, their computer numbers are good, but they've played a really tough schedule, but they're a 500 team right now at this point, and they've been up and down. And so I think right now they don't really have a win over a team that's going to be in the tournament. And I think that when you look at the Big Ten schedule that Indiana has, they've got double plays against Minnesota, Penn State, Nebraska. Those are teams that are, Nebraska's 60 in Ken Palm ahead of Indiana, but they're not projected to be maybe a top half Big Ten team at this point. So you're right. They're going to have to really do some work in Big Ten play. I mean, you look ahead at the schedule, home games like Ohio State, Purdue, Northwestern, Wisconsin, Michigan State at home. Those are the kind of games that they're going to have to be really good in, because we know how hard it is to win on the Big Ten on the road, and the Big Ten's down as a league this year. I'm not a bracketologist either, but just from talking to some people and kind of getting their thoughts on maybe this is a 6 or 7 bid league this year, as opposed to what it's been in the past. And I think really Indiana needed to get one of the 3 games against Connecticut, Auburn, and Kansas. And so they're 0-2 right now. They got Kansas coming to town on Saturday. Obviously, we know Assembly Hall can be a special place with the right atmosphere and Indiana playing well, but just doesn't seem like a great matchup on paper. And so we'll see kind of how it goes along here as the season progresses. But you're right, 17-14, 19-11 projection right now in Ken Palm. That's certainly not going to be good enough. And so we'll see how it goes. I think you have to be happy with the 7-2 mark right now overall, but just the trends in terms of playing against the top competition doesn't bode particularly well for the long haul of the season. Ryan, thanks for making the time early on this Monday morning to come back on Podcast on the Brink. It's always good to talk to you.
For sure. Sorry. Had myself on mute.
No problem. Thanks everybody for listening to Podcast on the Brink as usual. We will be back, I think, later this week with the second episode. Maybe previewing Kansas, just kind of looking ahead to what lies ahead with the schedule. So look for that later in the week. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.